So hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is Compliant and Effective Advertising in the USA. So if you've followed any of my webinars before, you probably know that I like to break down territories in particular when we're looking at advertising compliance, because obviously there's some different rules depending on which country you're looking at. But actually, it's a really important consideration about effective advertising as well, because obviously different consumers have different opinions, and it's usually reflected in a territory as well. When you're kind of generalizing which territory you're selling your product in, it's really important to understand those consumers and make sure you're communicating the right things. So your advert is effective, essentially. So just to break down the agenda of today, I'll look at a little overview of the US FMCG industry, because obviously advertising regulations are going to apply to anything in the consumer goods category. So that really kind of reflects the overall industry. And also in terms of when we look at claims, which is obviously a big thing when we're looking at effective advertising, again, it already falls into kind of no matter what consumer goods you're selling, they're going to have really similar trends and really similar regulations that we can look at there. So we'll be looking at those advertising regulations in particular for the USA. And as I mentioned, we'll be looking at claim substantiation. So once we've worked out what kind of things we can say about our product, what's really important to say about it to make sure that people want to buy it, and we know what regulations we're going to follow. How do we make sure that we've got substance behind those claims in the right territory so that we can make sure we can make some really effective compliant advertising claims? So I've got a case study that I'm going to share of a claim substantiation test we did in the US as well, in particular. So for those of you who don't know me, I am the Regulatory Director here at Ayton Global Research. So as most of you know, we conduct consumer research in particular, and as a part of that, a huge part of it is product testing for the purpose of claims substantiation. So I know a lot about regulations surrounding claims in pretty much every territory, and certainly in any territory that we operate. And I also know a lot about market research and regulations that follow good things like study design, questionnaire design, making sure that the data we're providing is quality, and it will validate your claims as well. So I've worked here for about a decade. A decade this year. So I've definitely got a lot of experience in running lots of different consumer studies, making sure that claims are validated as well. So if you've ever got a question about validate claims regulation, or if you want to look at a study with us, feel free to reach out. So as I said, I want to give us a bit of an overview today of the FMCG market, because lots of what we talk about today is going to apply to consumer goods. And it's really, I like always having an overview to go, right, well, why are we talking about the USA? Why is it important to have, you know, this kind of research and this kind of effect and be thinking about our consumers there? Well, quite simply, the USA is the biggest consumer good market in the world. So if you are selling consumer goods, it's a really good market to be in, because there's a lot of buyers, there's a lot of market, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of consumers there. So it's really good to know to sort of aim towards that market. There's going to be a compound annual growth rate of the market is predicted of 5% from 2022 to 2027. 5% is always one of those figures that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think of how many billions that is, it's a huge amount of money that you're going into investment there. And if 5% of your sales go up, people don't really grumble at that. You know, it's never a bad thing to see kind of that kind of increase in sales. So it's really important to think about what we're doing there. And this is all about the logistics market as well. So very focused on, actually sending products out to people, because this is such an important thing at the moment, to be thinking about sort of posting product as well as being able to have it sold in stores. I think any brand out there now should be selling online if they weren't already. It's something that was always going up, but now because of COVID and everything like that, it just keeps on continuing to grow. So it's all continuing to grow is my real take home there. So it's definitely not a market that's going to be shy anytime soon. Things about changing lifestyles, evolving consumer habits of people, having products that are going to be going with their habits, making sure they've got ease of access to the products as well, are all the key drivers. So it's really important that people are highly efficient, flexible, and have sustainable global supply chains. This is from Order Intelligence. to be able to make sure they get the product sent out there. And they had this graph that I thought was quite good about what kind of the sales growth during COVID-19 in particular, and in which category. So things like packaged foods and frozen foods were very much at the top with dairy. But then we also have things like home care, OTC health, and paper products are also very much up there as well. So there's, again, it's just lots of growth and lots of products being sold. So basically be a part of the market, and make sure that you're selling in the USA. And what's most important then for us to think about, if we're going to be selling in the USA, is obviously our ad self-regulation. So we're thinking about selling in the USA. Where do we start? How do we know that the products that we're selling there and the adverts we're making are going to be compliant with the relevant legislation that's out there? So I'm going to talk about a few things here. The USA is one of those markets that's slightly different to others. If you're not selling there already, and maybe if you're part of the EU or UK, I'm going to start with familiar territory, and then we'll expand. So the familiar territory is ad self-regulation. This is still a part in the USA. It's still up to you, whether you are the advertiser, so the product developer, the person making the adverts, the person carrying the advertising, whether that kind of fits to you or not. It's your responsibility to make sure those adverts are compliant with the relevant legislation and regulations for advertising. No one's going to do it for you, essentially, is the point. You need to understand it. You need to know what those regulations are, and you need to make sure your adverts are complying. You don't have to register products, especially, you don't have to register all products. And especially, I know a lot of you are going to have come from a cosmetic background, personal care background, especially in the USA. It's essentially much easier to sell products in terms of the registration process. But what it does mean is it leaves you more open to error as well. So especially when looking at advertising, you need to make sure you know what's going on with the regulation there. And I'll talk through in a bit more detail about where you need to go to find that. Basically, though, is making sure that adverts are legal, decent, honest, and truthful. And that's basically making sure they're fair for both the consumer. You don't want to mislead your consumers. You want to make sure they know what they're buying and they're getting what you're selling. But also your competitors. We need to have competition. It's really healthy. It's really important. It really drives innovation, and it really drives the market. But you need to make sure you're being fair to your competition as well, and making sure your adverts are compliant so that it's being fair. And generally it's dealt with on a complaints basis. So whether it's your consumer who buys your product and decides that it hasn't done what it says on the tin, they might complain to the relevant authorities, and again, I'll talk about them. Or it might be your competitor, and more than likely it will be your competitor, because if they feel you're making claims about your product but don't have the substance to back it up, they'll probably want to call you out because it's getting rid of some of their competition. So there's a few different things here. So I'm going to start off, like I said, I'll start off with the ad self-regulation. Let's see who does the self-regulation in the USA. The Better Business Bureau have national programs. So they want to foster trust, innovation, and competition in the marketplace. Everything we've kind of discussed as general ad self-regulation, and make sure they can do dispute resolution kind of outside of things. So they are the ad self-regulation body that's in the USA. They have codes that you can follow. You can access their resources, go on there, see what those advertising standards are, and make sure you're following them. And also talk to them if you do have a dispute or anything like that. You can go to BBB national programs to find out a bit more about that. They will basically want to minimize government intervention because that is a huge part of the USA. So let me move on to the next slide, and you can understand where I'm coming from with this. So as I said, if you're part of the EU or the UK or lots of other territories, the ad self-regulation is kind of where the buck stops. Now, there's things like trading standards, of course. So if they don't get anywhere, if the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK get nowhere, they can get trading standards involved. But actually in the USA, it's more than likely going to be the Federal Trade Commission that are going to be involved with any dispute in an advert. So that's what BBB are trying to do. They're trying to get that all sorted out before the FTC get involved. So they are a federal thing. So it's not self-regulation at this point. They're a federal body that are regulating adverts. So they want to, again, protect consumers, promote competition. It's the same language that's going throughout it all. They also want to develop tools and policy and make sure that, again, people are being protected. But what it does, it means that they enforce federal consumer protection laws that prevent fraud, deception, and unfair business practices. So by enforce, it means that they will be the ones that are policing what's out there. They'll catch up on trends. So again, complaints basis is still a huge thing, don't get me wrong, but they'll catch up onto things. So for example, we had it during COVID. People were claiming that herbal medicines could cure COVID. Obviously not. So they made sure they were trying to like wipe out those brands to make sure they weren't doing it, and enforcing law to do that. So under the law, claims and adverts must be truthful. They cannot be deceptive or unfair, and they must be evidence-based. So this is a huge part about what this webinar will be going about, is to make sure your adverts aren't deceptive, to make sure they're not misleading, to make sure they're not unfair. Generally, evidence is where we're going with things. And as I said, it's a not double edge, that's kind of a negative connotation, but it's a win-win, because you get your adverts substantiated, so they're evidence-based, but you also understand your consumer and make sure you're communicating the right things to them. They do provide resources for claims for the FTC. So if you've got a certain product, you can look at what resources they have and look at what the regulation is there as well. We also have the Food and Drug Administration. So again, this is where we're looking for kind of more resources, essentially, more information, and they work really closely with the FTC as well. So they'll be looking at anything that they regulate and making sure that it's all going through Federal Trade Commission, and so vice versa. But again, I know a lot of you will be from cosmetic companies. So that is where you will need to go about who is regulating cosmetics in the USA. As I mentioned, they don't need pre-authorization through FDA to be FDA approved. You see it really often when you see adverts in the USA where it just has a little kind of disclaimer that says it's not FDA regulated, which is crazy in a way when you think about it, because people could sell anything, but you could obviously get in trouble if you don't follow those regulations. So where you're not authorized by the FDA, you should still follow all relevant regulation, because they can pursue enforcement actions as well. And you do see you always see like things like class action lawsuits, and that's really common. There's been one that's been raised literally just the other day. I don't know if you guys have seen this, L'Oreal Paris. It's not obviously gone through yet, but they've raised it as a claim because they're an American company that has claimed to be French, as the consumers have put it, so by putting L'Oreal Paris, but actually the products are made and sold and distributed in the USA. So that's going to be really interesting to see what comes of that one. But again, this is all part of this kind of class action lawsuit. That's how it's being raised, is by saying us as consumers have been misled, we've been deceived. So we're going to kind of bring this forward. So that all comes through the FTC and the FDA and kind of things like that, making sure that these people are being heard and that things are happening from it. And like I said, it tends to be very expensive class action lawsuits, which you really don't want. So that's why I was bringing it up in the USA in particular, because whereas other countries, maybe it's just a case of removing your advert, it could be much more severe in the USA. So we've talked a lot about what's getting regulated. So we know USA is a great market. We know what the regulations are over there. We know where to go for the resources. Like I said, I'm not going to break down every regulation in this webinar. I'm going to point you in the right direction of how you find out what those regulations are. And those are the three companies that I'd be looking at if I was making adverts in the USA. But what is an advertising claim? Let's all get back on the same page, because whilst we know what the regulations are, how do we know what we're saying is an advertising claim in our marketing? So how do we know what's getting regulated? Because we keep saying claims need evidence, but what is that? Well, a claim is anything that's used to market your product, and it can appear anywhere. So it might be on the pack, it might be on your website, your social media, TV. Anything that you're saying about your product that is in the public domain is an advertising claim. It's anything that basically describes the effects. So we've got some examples around the screen just to make kind of back up what I'm saying, but things like dehydrated skin feels instantly supple and more elastic. These are the benefits of the product, is the effects. It should help people choose a product as well. So for example, on the neon one that's in the corner there, 91% people said that skin was nourished and hydrated and restored. So people that are looking for a product that's going to do those things, people that have dry skin that needs a bit of rescuing, that needs a bit of restoration, they'll be looking for those kinds of products. They'll be looking for those kinds of claims. It's how they find out that that's the product for them. They should help your product stand out in a crowded market. Let's look at the Animus result kind of example on the page. 100% of all their consumers agreed with all their claims. That's really going to help you stand out and make you look better than the competition is the other one there as well. They kind of come hand in hand. The standout is the thing that says, to me, there could be like 5 different moisturizers on a shelf. But I know that I want the one that's going to make my skin nourished and radiant and hydrated. So I'm going to choose the one that has all those claims on it. And then I'm going to make it look better than the competition is when it says in the data how many people agreed with it, and it's better than the competition as well. So that's why we have advertising claims, and that's what it is. Now I've been talking about having substance and having evidence-based claims. How do we substantiate these claims? What options are there? And there's 2 kind of the routes that I'm going to describe today. And one's clinical claim substantiation. So there's 3 methods, in vivo, so on a person. Ex vivo is not on a person, but it's like person substance. that doesn't make sense. Like hair tresses, if you're doing like a study on hair tresses. So it's a person's like makeup. I'm really bad at finding words today, but it's not on them actually like being there. And in vitro, which is in like a it's basically like a what you call like a petri dish study. So it's not something that is on a human sample. You see a lot of it in like microbial studies, so things like making sure that things are preserved, that kind of stuff. Again, I sound like I really don't know what I'm talking about, but I swear the words are just trying to get out. But we're going to focus on in vivo, because this is what we're talking about, is things like performance claims in particular. That's going to have to be done on a human. It's going to have to be done on a person. If we're talking about moisturization, it needs to be done on a person's skin and radiance and all that kind of thing. So clinical substantiation is one method of the human study. So again, it's anything that's applied, and it's using instruments. So as opposed to consumer research, which I'll discuss in a minute, which is where you're just kind of applying it, you're having some kind of instrumental technique. So like a measurement and a quantitative measurement as well. So things like it's supporting ingredient claims, it could be supporting the final product. But essentially, what I'm saying about like an instrument, I need to kind of explain that a bit further. If we were looking at, say, a study for diminishing wrinkles, we would apply it to the skin. We'd take a picture of the wrinkles on a very high-tech piece of equipment that really shows the depth and the gradient of the wrinkle, apply the cream, and then do another picture and see what the effect is on it there. So that's really important to be able to get that kind of objective research for claims that, you know, that can't have kind of any sort of variability within them. So there's lots of different standard techniques there. And yeah, that's kind of the clinical side, sorry. The consumer side is what I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail, which is what I just mentioned. So we take away the instruments, we take away all of that side, and we're just looking at, you know, how people perceive the product itself. And it's what happens if they actually use the product as they would use it. So as I say, reflecting the actual conditions of the product. So basically, yeah, people are sent products to test at home. Generally, they followed the usage instructions as if they were following what they would have on their pack copy, and then they're answering online questionnaires about those things as well. So this is really important to be able to get this is really important to be able to gauge the perception of the products with your target consumer. So as I mentioned earlier, this is where we're going about the effective claims, right? So we know we've got compliant claims, we've done our regulation, we're getting evidence-based. To make sure it's effective, we need to make sure that we are we need to make sure that we're listening to the consumers in that country and understanding what they like about the product and what they rate really well about it, and then communicating it back to them when we do our adverts. And that's really important to get through a consumer study. You might need additional evidence. So for example, where I just brought up the wrinkle claim, where we would do that. So for a consumer study, for example, you might say 90% of people agree that their wrinkles are less visible. if we wanted to have a kind of a data that said that the wrinkles were reduced by such and such a percent, a consumer cannot evaluate that because it's a measurement. So we need to have the evidence from a clinical study for that kind of thing. So that's kind of the difference there. And a lot of times we can do things like word claims to be able to do it through consumer research, because looking at the advantages of it, it does have a faster response time, and it does have a reasonable cost. So where for a clinical study, you might have to do lots of different instrumental studies to cover all the claims you want to assess on your product. For a consumer study, you can have someone do one study and assess all of the claims within it. So it does make things a bit quicker and a little bit cheaper as well. So you can, again, you can, I was kind of back at what I said, there's simultaneous validation, which backs that up. You can also target a wide range of consumers. So whereas a clinical study, it would have to be that they'd have to come to a lab. So you're really restricted to who you've got there. If you were saying, yeah, launching in the USA and you're like, okay, we're going to put a store on the East Coast and the West Coast, we need to make sure we've got consumers that are going to be, you know, on both sides. You can do one study and send products either way and do that. We've also done with different climates in the USA, where there's some states that are quite hot, there's some states that are quite cold, and that doesn't really change much of the year round. We've done tests like that to make sure the product's going to have the same performance if it is sold nationwide and in those different territories. So it's really great to get that kind of effect. You can also gather marketing materials. So as well as substantiating your claims, you can get things like before and after photos, you can get testimonials from the participants, you can get videos, and all of these you can use in your marketing, which is great. So like I said, it's always easier for me to put these things into context, and a case study is always the best way to do that. So in this case, I've got a hair care brand that I want to discuss. So this is a beach wave spray. And the objective of the study was to assess the efficacy of the product. So make sure it actually performs as they were expecting. That's another huge part of it. When you're developing products, you may not know exactly how they're going to perform with those when they kind of used an actual use, until you've actually sent them out there, because it might be that you've just had a few testers in your office, you might have sent it out to the staff, but you haven't sent out 100 products to people to test. So for this one, they wanted to test it on different curl types in the USA as well. So making sure they're gauging their consumers and the expected consumers they're going to have. Because that's really important as well, making sure that all those things that you know your product is going to be beneficial for, making sure you're capturing that. So you're capturing your consumer to, again, capture their voice. So they wanted to make sure they substantiate claims, particularly surrounding texturizing the hair and creating desired waves. So what's the panel criteria for the study? So we all had females. Again, this is their target consumer. They knew they were going to target females for their marketing. They wanted to have a gauge of people with different hair lengths. So 50% were going to be shoulder length or higher, and then 50% was going to be longer than shoulder length, because they needed to make sure that they were getting all the different hair lengths to make sure it's going to perform how they wanted it to. They're concerned with flat or lifeless hair. So again, want to make sure we've got the volumizing side. They already had to use a prestige brand of wave spray. This can be really important, again, if you're reflecting your consumer and you have people that, for example, maybe use things that maybe aren't so good in quality, and you know that yours is going to be sitting within a certain band of competition. You want people that are already using that competition, because if you get really amazing results and then your price point is much higher than what the people in the study were used to paying, then maybe the products that are that higher price point are going to be more competitive. So I'm saying maybe because sometimes we've had some budget products that have done outstandingly well. So it doesn't always the case, but you can look at this and make sure that you're sitting within your competition. We also had a split of curl types. So as I said, it's kind of weighted depending on who they knew was their main consumers. So their main consumers were people with 1A to 2C curl types, but they also wanted to assess people with 3A to 4C, because they want to make sure that the product's available for everyone and that it performs well for everyone as well. So what were the conditions? And again, this has to reflect the actual use. So we had the participants use the product at least 4 times over the 2-week study time. They had to spray it into their hands and evenly distribute it throughout their hair to create that texture. Obviously, the application area was the hair, and we had some information about restrictions for use as well, and making sure they can report any adverse reactions. That's also an important point, again, about doing these kind of large scale studies, because a safety test will give you obviously your data to say it's a non-irritant, but you never know what adverse reactions could be out there until you do a larger scale study and you're recording what those adverse reactions are. Unlikely to be serious, but it's really good to have this knowledge under your belt before you start selling things, because if you find out that people are that there's irritations that are happening, either you need to reformulate, or you just need to be very aware of what those irritations are, so you know how to respond to them, or you know how to explain the restrictions for use when you're selling the product. So what were the results? Because again, this is going back to our claims. How do we then make claims out of this data? We've done our research, we've sent the products to people to test at home, they've answered an online questionnaire, and how do we get those claims that we want to substantiate? So I've taken a real small snippet from our report. So we have a whole PDF report which breaks down obviously all the statistical analysis in lots of detail. And then right at the end, we get an appendix like this, which breaks down the questions that we asked, the number of people that had a satisfied, neutral, or not satisfied answer, and then the percentage of people that had a satisfied, neutral, or not satisfied answer. So for example, on the first question, we've got people saying their hair has a natural beachy wave look. 78% of people have agreed with that. That can go into marketing. 83% said that texture is long lasting. Excellent. 87% of people said it amplifies their texture. And 77% said their hair looks and feels thicker. So this is really targeting those initial claims we really want to make. Again, there's much more claims than this, but I'm just going to take a snippet view for today. And you can see how easy it is then to just take the percentage of people that agree with a claim and quote it verbatim in your marketing. And because you know what the volunteers really like, what the participants really liked in the study, you know that, say, your 80% are probably going to be your real shouters in your marketing, because you know that's the ones that have done the best. Just going back to the legislation there. So how do we make sure we can use that, that evidence there? The FTC state that advertising must be truthful and non-deceptive. They must have evidence to back up their claims, and they can't be unfair. So again, quoting that evidence verbatim, making sure we've quoted the data correctly and the percentage correctly, is going to make sure we're abiding by these regulations. So what are these examples in context again? So I've talked about where's our claims substantiation, what does it like to design a study, what does it actually look like in advertising, who's doing it? So I've chosen a couple of brands that I know are very successful in the States. So for this one, we've got Elemis's Pro Collagen Marine Cream. The description is saying that it firms, smooths and hydrates, and that it's got a clinically proven anti-wrinkle moisturizer. It improves hydration, leaves skin looking, feeling firmer. This is then further backed up by clinical and user trials. We've got a before and after picture. We've got 100% in the clinical trial stated, oh, sorry, yeah, 100%, oh no, sorry, the 100%. The one asterisk was for the clinically proven anti-wrinkle moisturizer. So that's a clinical 38 people over 4 weeks. Then both of these quotes are coming from the independent user trial, which is 120 people over 4 weeks. We've got 100% of people said it gave their skin immediate improvement in hydration. And 95% of people said it's the best anti-aging cream they've ever used. So how great does that look when you're communicating that back to your consumer? You guys said this is the best cream you've ever used, and you're putting it in your advertising. And again, we've got their clinical quote in their Instagram post as well. So just showing you can put it on website, Instagram, social media, wherever you can really brag about these claims. I've also got Kajaya Vice and their foundation studies, so their consumer results and how they've used those. So this is their Invisible Touch foundation, which they've got kind of information about the different shades there. Again, they've got before and after of the model that's put it on. They've put their consumer results again into some imagery, as well as some quotes on their website. So people about saying it feels, it forms as well as a leading prestige brand. So that's from a comparison study. So making sure they've compared it against a leading prestige from formulation. You can do comparison studies as long as you've got the data to back it up. People saying it's got a healthy glow, lightweight, it's soothing. And then again, all of that put into this lovely image as well to really brag about what they've able to achieve. And again, really clearly stating their data in their marketing. So that's what it kind of looks like. So I hope that's given you a really good overview of what the legislation is in the USA for advertising standards, but also how you can use claim substantiation to actually work in your favor and really communicate those adverts effectively to your consumers. I forgot to say at the beginning, I am going to do a Q&A, by the way. So I'm going to do this little summary, but if you've got any questions, now's the time to start putting it in the little Q&A box at the bottom, on your screen. So we're on that Zoom menu. So feel free to start asking questions away while I just summarize today's webinar. So it's essential to use advertising claims to stand out against your competition. I always like to say this because so many people will be like, oh, well, I don't really want to spend all the money and do all the claim substantiation. I know my product works, it will sell itself. It really won't, unfortunately. If you don't say what the product is and why people should buy it, people won't really buy it because there's so many products out there that do have that information. You need to make sure that your data is compliant in the country you're selling it in. So again, making sure you know what the US regulations are and making sure it's compliant with them. Always make sure you've got the consumers' feedback in those key markets as well. So again, it can happen where people say, okay, I've got the claim substantiation from data in the UK. I think I can use that in the US. Well, in cases you may be able to use that data, but are you really understanding what the US consumer wants? And are you really communicating it back to them? Because you probably won't be as effective with your marketing in that case. Regulations do change, so always make sure you're staying informed because things can change, things can come in. Class action lawsuits like the one I mentioned earlier can start to be raised, which can obviously cause a kind of ongoing effect to regulation as well. And always clearly display your evidence in your advertising to avoid that scrutiny. Like in those examples I've stated, says really clearly how the amount of people, the amount of weeks, if you don't really sort of say where the evidence has come from, people are going to doubt it. So it's really important to display that. So I can see a couple of questions coming in. So I'm going to go to those now. So the first one, is there a minimum number of people who should take part in a consumer study to make it valid? And are there any rules on this? I'm smiling because this is a question that comes up a lot. So it's really important to address it. There actually isn't in terms of regulation. So if I was looking at the advertising standards, so if I was looking at the Better Business Bureau or the FTC or the FDA, there is no rule that says this is the number of consumers you need. It just states that you need to have verifiable, robust evidence, which of course is really open to interpretation. So when we're looking at this kind of thing, if we're looking at a study that we're conducting with someone, that we're designing with someone, we look at the product itself, we look at the claims you're making, we're looking at the consumers and the target group, and we're basing the minimum number of responses on all of those factors. This is because obviously, for example, in that example I've given from the case study, they wanted hair types on there, right? So like curl types, everything like that. We need to have a significant number of people in that study. Otherwise, if we start breaking it down into these subgroups, there's going to be no significance in the data. Whereas if we just had a product that was for Afro hair, well, that's one curl type we're looking at in particular, and you may not need as much data to be able to substantiate it. It can also be to do with the claim itself. If things are kind of more stronger, you're going to need a bit more evidence for a comparison claim like the one I mentioned. You need much more data because obviously people are comparing opinion. We can't say, oh yeah, it's definitely better than the other without enough people agreeing with that. So yeah, there's lots of variables, but it's something we can always help with if you're unsure as well. On the next question, are we okay using UK consumer research in the UK? I don't know if you mean UK consumer research in the USA. I just want to double check that. So again, it depends. So I said in some cases you may be able to use it. It depends on the product. The reason I'm saying this, for example, is we had it before where we had a foundation study. This isn't the USA in particular, but you'll see what I mean about different territories. We had a foundation study we conducted in the UK. It achieved the claim long lasting. And then they looked at the Malaysian market, and obviously they couldn't use the claim long lasting because the climate was very different. So obviously, you know, in the UK where it's pretty dry and it's pretty cold, things might last a bit longer on the skin. And in Malaysia where it's very humid and your foundation is likely to sweat, it's not going to be able to get that claim without further substantiation that it will perform in that climate. So it always depends on a case-by-case basis. It always depends on a product-by-product basis. UK and US are very similar. Very often it's absolutely fine to use the data. I would always just check for advice anyway. But again, it's making sure you've got the right consumers reviewing the product as well and getting their data in particular. Do you always need to state the percentage, or can you just say immediately makes skin look smoother? If enough people have agreed, you can use data to create pack copy, essentially, to create marketing copy. So yeah, you can say that, but you would still need to quote the data somewhere within that. So if I can explain in a bit more, if I explain it on this example, actually, where we've got this one by Elemis, and it says an anti-wrinkle moisturizer that's clinically proven to improve hydration, leaving skin looking and feeling firmer and more radiant. They haven't said the percentage of people there, but they've given a little asterisk to the data over here. Now that is what you should be doing, really, is always showing the data somewhere on the screen. So if you're not using it, or on the pack or wherever, so you're not using it directly to say the percentage, you're at least saying where that's come from, and how those claims are substantiated. And also just someone asking if it'll be recorded. Again, I forgot to say at the beginning, I'm usually very good at introducing everything, like the rules. But yeah, it will be recorded, and I'll be sending it out straight after, so you'll be able to catch up there. Great, so I've got no other questions coming at the moment. So hopefully that means I've managed to answer all your queries. I will be sending out as I'm, oh, I've got a hand raised. I don't know if that's another question coming, but I don't know. If you put the question, oh yeah, it goes. One last one. It's all right, take your time. I'll just say I will be sending out the recording after, and I will be sending my contact information within that as well. So if you do have another question, you can just contact me directly, but I'll wait for this one last question now. And then following that, if you've got any, feel free to contact me when the recording goes out, and I'll be able to help with that one. So I'll wait a couple of minutes because I'm curious now what the question is as well. I'm gonna keep, oh no, okay. Anti-dandruff in the US, does it have to be based on the monograph always? Will a user trial be required? Okay, interesting in particular. For anti-dandruff studies in the US, they do have slightly different regulations. Well, the US can be quite strict on claims, right? What I was saying before, that they're not as regulated in terms of being able to pre-authorize, but there's kind of stricter regulations in terms of what studies would be required for validation. And generally, anti-dandruff does have to be a clinical study. Monograph, I don't know how they're done exactly because I don't do clinical studies, but I do know there has to be a clinical assessment. Can you substantiate it through a user trial alone? Probably not. Would it be beneficial to do a user trial as well? Probably yes. The reason for that being, with any clinical claim, if we have a kind of small panel of people, and you can kind of say, right, we've got a monograph to represent the flakes have been removed from the hair, everything like that. It's then making sure you've got some kind of evidence to say that the actual consumers can perceive it themselves. So we all obviously we always like to use user trials, but I really do believe that I think it's a very successful way of making effective claims. Let's go back to that. This is all about not just regulation, this webinar, it's about effectiveness as well. So if you've got some data that shows that the users, when they used it in their own home, really noticed a difference to their dandruff, they couldn't see the flakes, they couldn't they notice less itchiness, everything like that, you're going to have much more success when you market the product. But very likely you're going to need a clinical study as well. I've just got another question to come in. You're going to need a clinical study as well as a user trial for the anti-dandruff claim in particular. So that is a good point. And again, though, this is really where we do help advise, even though we don't conduct clinical research ourselves, we have partner labs we go with. And I always make sure that, we always make sure that our clients have got compliant claims. So if you have a particular project, if you have a particular product you're looking to sell in a market, and you have particular claims and you want to know what's the right substantiation, please do come with us, and we'll be able to discuss the project in more detail there. So I hope that helps. I've just also got an interesting claim from Ryan a question coming from Ryan about a certain claim. Scientifically proven and clinically proven, what is the difference? Very interesting. This could relate to a few different things. Now, scientifically proven to me would mean something about the formulation itself. And it could be tested, as we mentioned earlier, sort of in vitro, something like that. So it's not necessarily done in a clinical laboratory, but it's something that's about the formulation. You can have things like scientifically proven. I've seen claims about certain types of microbiomes and everything like that, which is obviously not necessarily about the performance of the product, but about the science behind the formulation. So that tends to be where you see scientifically proven. Clinically proven is about, it has to be a clinical study. So a clinical study is an in vivo on human test in a laboratory, in a lab set, not in a lab setting, in a clinical setting. So it will be tested on a human for it to be a clinical study, for it to be a clinical claim. I hope that makes sense. So scientific could be not necessarily on a human, clinically proven would have to be on a person in a clinical setting. I am going to wrap it up there. So if there's any other questions that come in, just feel free to email them over to me. So just to wrap up for today as well, we are sponsors, very proud sponsors of the IFSCC Congress, which is this year. It's going to be so quickly. And that's going to be on the 19th to 22nd of September. So please do register your interest and come and see us exhibiting there. I've got an upcoming webinar next month, and I've just realized I put the 8th and not the 3rd, which is great. But it's the 10th of the 3rd. I've just had this confirmed before this webinar, and I quickly put that in there. But I'll follow up with invites. Anyway, so I'll be joined with Thomas Marquardt, and we'll be talking about insights and utilizing research to understand your consumer. So everything I've talked about a little bit about today, about understanding your consumer and communicating things back to them. This is all going to be about behavioral research and actually understanding that in much more detail and training your consumer to buy your product, essentially, which is very clever. So we'll be talking about that in a bit more detail. There's my contact information. I hope that that's been really helpful today. As I said, please do contact me if you've got any further questions. And yes, I'll be sending that out not long with the recording. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. And yeah, see you soon.